Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Way back when I used to do videos regarding ancient Kemet, I pointed out that the fictional field of Egyptology was started on America's colleges and universities, and it was part of the ideology of white supremacy to invent ways to validate itself. Now, this love affair by America's Ivy League with anti-black racism didn't just start in the late 19th century. The richest and most prestigious schools in the world, right here in the United States, were founded on anti-black racism and funded by chattel slavery. Now, obviously, we're not going to be doing an exhaustive rundown of that. I'd be here for the next couple of weeks. Instead, we're going to pick a couple of examples, the two most prestigious and richest schools in the world, Harvard and Yale. We'll start with Harvard. At least two of the presidents of Harvard University were slave owners, and one of them, Benjamin Wadsworth, had his slaves living on the campus of Harvard. Harvard only recently put up a plaque acknowledging this fact, but only after the students put pressure on them to do so. John Hancock, one of the founders of the United States, was a Harvard graduate. He owned between 2,000 and 3,000 slaves. Of course, the apologists for white supremacy always try to say, well, he inherited them from his uncle. So what? That's how Thomas Jefferson got his slaves. Same for George Washington. Barack Obama bragged that he went to Harvard Law School and became the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review. Well, that explains in part why Obama never used the law to help black people. Harvard's law school was built in 1817 from funds given to them by Isaac Royall Jr. Isaac Royall Jr. came from a family of slave owners. Isaac Royall's family were in the slave trade before he was even born. Not only were they selling black people, but they also had their little plantations. So as part of his will, he made sure that Harvard University had some land and some funds that they could use to build themselves a law school. Yeah, that way they could train the next generation of white supremacists. Now, I'm sure you've seen this photograph. We all have. Whenever a TV program or documentary dealing with slavery comes on, this man's photo is usually presented. If there's some book that deals with antebellum slavery in the United States, the odds are good that this man's photograph is going to show up. His name was Renty. He was enslaved on the plantation of Colonel Thomas Taylor in Columbia, South Carolina. Our ancestors were forced to do all manner of degrading things, and this was one of them. There are, as many of you know, other photos of Renty and other enslaved black people, including Renty's own daughter, but I'm not going to be showing them. What you need to know about is the story behind it. Do you know how this photograph and the others came to be? Because in 1850, Harvard University commissioned this photo and the others. They did it on behalf of one of their professors, Louis Agassiz. This man was a zoologist, and under white supremacy, there's no white man who's so unqualified that he can't be allowed to give his opinion about black people. He was a proponent of polygenesis, the idea that black and white people have separate origins and hence are separate species altogether. As a faculty member in the Ivy League, Agassiz understood it was Harvard's mission to prove the superiority of the white race and the inferiority of black people. So he asked that a set of pictures be taken of black people undressed. This was done on behalf of Harvard University, who, by the way, still possesses those photos. And it wasn't done for a history course, but for a biology course, specifically to push the idea that black people are inherently inferior. For reasons. The Ivy League schools are where the doctrines of black physical and mental inferiority began, and they're also the main ones pushing it to this very day. It's where the white supremacists work to give their crackpot theories an air of legitimacy by using or even inventing academic-sounding language. It's one of white supremacy's favorite ploys. Use $10 words to try to dupe people into thinking that their blatant anti-black racism somehow is intellectual. This is what Harvard University is about. One of Renty's descendants went to court to force Harvard to give the photos of her ancestors to their family, but the courts declared that they belong to Harvard. Harvard makes money off these photos, by the way. They use them on the covers of their brochures. After the lawsuit, Harvard declared that they were going to be making the photos more accessible to the public. No doubt for the price of a ticket. So in other words, it's business as usual for Harvard. And that's not all. Almost exactly 1 year ago, Harvard's own Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology discovered that they have the remains of enslaved black people among their collections. Sure, they just now figured that out. And I'm sure that all of the uprisings and black people holding racist institutions to account didn't have anything to do with Harvard suddenly discovering, man, we got the remains of these enslaved black folks in our possession. They didn't figure it out until now. They didn't even know about it until now. Yeah, right. And Yale, of course, was no better. Yale University is named after Elihu Yale. Now, he wasn't the founder of it, but it was named after him because of his generous donations to it. White media makes it a point to hide behind the lie that there's no evidence that Elihu Yale ever owned slaves, as if that makes his being in the slave trade less reprehensible. As governor of Fort St. George, he oversaw and authorized the sale of hundreds of people. And for a man who apparently had all manner of reservations about slavery, he sure didn't have a problem having portraits of himself painted alongside enslaved black people and making sure they were featured prominently. Because that's how the white supremacists of old showed the world that they had arrived, that they owned people. For a man who allegedly didn't own any slaves, he sure did seem proud of being seen with them. So to say that Elihu Yale never owned slaves would be like saying Osama bin Laden never made a bomb or never hijacked an airplane. Elihu Yale was born in 1649, long before the U.S. was founded. He came from a prosperous family. His father was a merchant in Boston, but apparently he must not have liked the weather because Yale's father took the family back to their native Britain. Elihu Yale never set foot in the Americas again, though after a lifetime of enslaving, pillaging, and plundering, he decided to become a benefactor of sorts to a school in New Haven, Connecticut called the Collegiate School of Saybrook. He sent a donation of books to the school in 1718. Noted Harvard graduate and slave owner Cotton Mather wrote to Yale telling him that if he sent another gift, only larger this time, they could be influenced to name a school after him. Yale could take a hint, so he sent more books, a picture of the British dictator King George, and textiles from the East Indies. The people in Connecticut sold the donations for cash, getting them £800, which they used to construct a building which they named after Yale. So if you ever wondered where the American tradition of schools naming their buildings after rich donors comes from, now you know. Yale finally kicked the bucket in 1721, and in 1745, the people at Saybrook, changed the name of their little community college to Yale University. Of course, Yale University's connections with slavery didn't end with Elihu Yale. Yale's own website had to admit that the university's Connecticut Hall was built by slaves. But it didn't end there. In the early 18th century, the Colonial Assembly of Connecticut gave the tax revenue they generated from slave-produced sugar cane to Yale University. Yale used the money to fund the school and to construct a number of their early buildings. So Yale University was literally built with money from the slave trade, and it was the state who gave it to them. There were also a lot of slave owners connected to the school, including half of its founding trustees. One of Yale's most famous school presidents, Timothy Dwight IV, was a slave owner. He was also a mentor to a large number of other pro-slavery fanatics, including John C. Calhoun. John Calhoun became a senator and then vice president of the United States. He also owned about 80 black people as slaves. Now, you don't hear much of anything about old John Calhoun, and that's because the white media can't portray him as being conflicted over slavery. You know, the usual line of BS that they bring up whenever talking about some slave owner. You can't do the usual, well, his relationship with slavery was complicated. He was a complicated man. No, John Calhoun was as straightforward and simple about slavery as it comes. He delivered a pro-slavery speech to the U.S. Senate on February 6, 1837, in which he declared, "Abolition and the Union cannot coexist. As the friend of the Union, I openly proclaim it, and the sooner it is known, the better. We of the South will not, cannot surrender our institutions. To maintain the existing relations between the two races inhabiting that sector of the Union is indispensable to the peace and happiness of both. It cannot be subverted without drenching the country in blood and extirpating one or the other of the races. Be it good or bad, slavery has grown up with our society and institutions and is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people. But let me not be understood as admitting, even by implication, that the existing relations between the two races in the slaveholding states is an evil. Far otherwise. I hold it to be a good, as it has thus far proved itself to be to both, and will continue to prove so if not disturbed by the fell spirit of abolition. Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and so improved, not only physically but morally and intellectually. I may say with truth that in few countries so much is left to the share of the laborer and so little exacted from him. It would be a miracle if he was saying that with a straight face, craggy and crooked as his is. Anyway, he continued saying, compare his condition, talking about our ancestors, with the tenants of the poor houses in the more civilized portions of Europe. Look at the sick and the old and infirm slave on one hand, in the midst of his family and friends, under the kind superintending care of his master and mistress, and compare it with the forlorn and wretched condition of the pauper in the poorhouse. I turn to the political, and here I fearlessly assert that the existing relation between the two races in the South forms the most solid and durable foundation on which to rear free and stable political institutions. It is useless to disguise the fact. There is, and always has been, an advanced stage of wealth and civilization, a conflict between labor and capital. The condition of society in the South exempts us from the disorders and dangers resulting from this conflict. This is what one of Yale University's most celebrated and revered graduates said to the U.S. Senate. He said the slave plantation solved the conflict between labor and capital. That's what he was saying. People have arguments about conflicts between labor and capital today. John Calhoun said, we found the answer. But it's what he said before that I think is even more important. He says that the enslavement of black people is the most solid and durable foundation for a free and stable political institution. That's important for you folks out here who keep talking all this idiocy about democracy and preserving institutions and such. John Calhoun explained what America's political structures are built on. They're built on your black back. Black subjugation is the foundation upon which the United States rests. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's not the messy excesses of freedom. This is what it's all about. This is the game. Keep black people oppressed. Because the sick, degenerate mentality of John Calhoun wasn't limited just to him. This is the indoctrination that the Ivy League schools give to their graduates to the present day. They just don't say it as bluntly as Calhoun did. And then you wonder why Barack Obama twiddles his thumbs and says, actually, not really a whole lot I can do. Nothing I can do. Why is it that the Democrats make it a point they're not going to do anything that black people says? Why, that would bring down the republic. This is why black people cannot afford to let white liberals tell us that our problem is a class problem. The people with money in this country, they don't look at white people the same way they look at black folks. Calhoun didn't propose that his solution should be enforced against white people, just black people. So what does that tell you? His solution wasn't a class issue, it was a racial one. And that keeping black people oppressed was the best way to perpetuate and reinforce their political institutions. He made it very clear that this is about more than just money. It's about more than just a white racist feeling superior. Oppressing black people is the foundation upon which Western civilization rests. Black oppression is what makes this country's political institutions stable. If black people are able to change their condition, then that threatens not just the slave owners, but the entire system. Now, I want you to think about all of the Yale and Harvard graduates that you got in the U.S. government and in corporate America. Everything from entertainment to all of these little schools and such. These guys claim to have all kinds of differing ideas when it comes to society, politics, the arts and such, but when it comes to black people, they're all in lockstep about that. Because anti-black racism was not merely part of their education, it was the totality of it. Yale and their graduates have been taught for hundreds of years that the best way to have free and stable political institutions is anti-black racism. The way to eliminate the conflict between labor and capital is not to pay more or to have better working conditions, but to dehumanize black people who do the work and define them as being less than human. Now I can hear the white supremacist troll or the bootlick saying now, well, you can't directly connect John Calhoun's anti-black racism to Yale. That was just him ranting in front of the Congress. You can't actually say that Yale approved of that. Actually, I can. In 1933, Yale built the Calhoun College, and they decorated it with stained glass windows, one of which depicted Calhoun standing with an enslaved black man kneeling before him in shackles. Another of the stained glass images showed black people toiling in the cotton fields. This is no exaggeration. This is what Yale University put on the windows of their Calhoun College. This was not a choice by some architect. This is what Yale wanted there. Yale had those images up for decades until a few years ago when a black Yale alumni made them remove the panels showing the black man shackled and kneeling in front of Calhoun. Now, they left up the part about Calhoun. They left that up. They just said, okay, we'll go ahead and remove the black man from there, but we'll keep the rest of it. Later on, a black man who worked there broke the window showing the plantation scene. Yale tried to clean it up and white-splain after the fact and say, well, they had planned to remove that image all along themselves. Yeah, sure they did. Now understand something. John Calhoun didn't build that college. He was already dead and roasting in hell long before that college was built. It was the white supremacists who run Yale who were the ones who decided to build a monument to him. They knew exactly what he was about, because it's exactly what they're about. And if black people hadn't put pressure on Yale, they'd still have up pictures of shackled black men kneeling in front of slave owners. Those images were an expression of philosophy on Yale's part, not just the racists who built that thing back in the 30s, but for the school who allows it to be there to the present day. But Yale's involvement with anti-black racism goes way beyond just some racist politicians and artwork. Yale is not just connected to the eugenics movement. Yale University was one of the main backers of it. Yale's own website admits that the American Eugenic Society was started at Yale. It was a Yale faculty member who thought it up, and at least 3 Yale faculty members were on its board. Though the Yale website conveniently leaves out who these members are, and they don't say where you can find the information either. Yale pats itself on the back for confronting its historical involvement with slavery, but they only give fragments of information. A partial confession isn't a confession at all. It just goes to show never send a white supremacist pseudo-academic to do a professor's job. The American Eugenic Society was founded at Yale University in 1926. Irving Fisher, a Yale faculty member who taught economics at the school, was the one who thought it up. He was a die-hard white supremacist, obsessed with racial purity, particularly being pure from black people. Prior to the American Eugenic Society, Fisher had helped to found the Race Betterment Foundation in 1914. By the way, the man who co-founded the Race Betterment Foundation with Fisher and provided him with the money is a name that you'll probably readily recognize. John Henry Kellogg. Yes, that Kellogg's. In fact, John Kellogg is credited with having invented the baking process for turning the flat sheets of dough into flakes. In other words, he's credited with being the inventor of breakfast cereal. So maybe Tony the Tiger's motto should be, "They're racist." On a side note, John Kellogg was also an alleged doctor who ran a sanitarium, believe it or not, where he pioneered all manner of groundbreaking therapies, including electric current administered to the eyeballs and the 15-quart enema. I'm not making that last part up. That was one of his ideas, to run 15 quarts of water through someone's colon to cleanse it. I don't know if this Kellogg guy ran the sanitarium or if he escaped from it, but I want you to understand these are the guys who were the main proponents of eugenics in the United States, the main ones running around talking about bettering the race, mostly by getting rid of inferior people. This is the kind of stuff that these guys were up to. Anyway, back to Kellogg's unindicted co-conspirator, Irving Fisher. Fisher was heavily involved in the eugenics movement and attended the Eugenicists International meetings. He was the one who proposed the creation of the American Eugenic Society, and he knew just the place that it should be headquartered, at his place of employment, Yale University. So understand, it was a Yale-educated economist who was the most gung-ho to spread the idea of black people being inherently inferior. Now, when you understand that Fisher was an economist, John Calhoun's statements about labor and capital take on a deeper meaning, don't they? Another Yale faculty member, Dean Winternitz, who was the dean of Yale's medical school, was also a founding member of the American Eugenic Society. Ellsworth Huntington was a geography professor at Yale from 1907 until 1917. About 15 years later, he became president of the board of the American Eugenicist Society. This is what Yale University did. The doctrines of anti-black racism, it was not just a matter of one or two fuzzy-headed academics who were there. It wasn't just one or two professors. These guys wanted to make it where their schools were going to be the central hub. It was going to be the core of the eugenics movement. It wasn't born out of some political movement. It wasn't born in some church or some political party. It came out of the universities. These guys knew that there would be absolutely no opposition to them setting up a eugenics society on school campus precisely because that was the mission of the Ivy League schools. And not only were they obsessed with making sure that they spread and promoted the ideals of anti-black racism, but they also were hell-bound and determined that black people were never going to be able to set up institutions of their own. In the early 19th century, a collection of free black leaders attempted to establish a college for colored youth in New Haven, and they were fought by both the city and by Yale University. As Yale's own website admits, the proposed college met overwhelming resistance from the Yale and New Haven communities, including prominent Yale faculty and alumni. Opponents argued that a new black college would harm the city's existing institutions, including Yale and a school for women. As one resolution against the building of the school put it, "The establishment of a college in the same place to educate the colored population is incompatible with prosperity." Of course, these few examples that I give you from Harvard and Yale barely even skim the surface of the Ivy League's mountain of crimes. But again, I'll be here till next week if I try to do something that's even halfway exhaustive. The relevant question, in fact, the entire reason that I wanted to single out the Ivy League schools for the Who Owes Us Reparations series, is how much money did these slave-owning institutions reap from their anti-black racism? Well, it made Harvard University the wealthiest school on the planet. Harvard University's endowment is now valued at $53.2 billion. That's billion with a B. Harvard University takes the money they get from tuitions and donors and such, and they invest it in the stock market. They're not a school, clearly. They're an investment house masquerading as a school. And Yale's endowment comes in second place with a mere $42.3 billion. So understand that anti-black racism, chattel slavery didn't just make the Ivy League schools financially stable. It didn't just make them rich. It enabled them to become unbelievably wealthy. And what have these schools done with all that ill-gotten money? They use it to justify the dehumanization and segregation and oppression of black people. Their alumni went into high office and they used the prestige of the university to write laws and to push policies meant to dehumanize and to marginalize black people out of existence. And it's not just the Ivy League, of course. University of Virginia is racist as hell. How could it not be? It was founded by Thomas Jefferson. The school had black slaves who were forced to labor there. How can a school claim to be a place that values knowledge above all else when the guy who founded it wouldn't even own up to the children he had by the woman that he raped for 30 years? Because white supremacy has no principles other than power. And just to show you how all of this stuff is interconnected, last week we were talking about the railroads, you'll recall. You might have heard of the name Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was a railroad and shipping magnate. He was also a slave owner. And he used his money to found Vanderbilt University. The first chancellor of Vanderbilt, Landon Garland, was a slave owner and lectured around the country that black people were inherently inferior and slavery was the biggest favor ever done for black people and had made black people, quote, serviceable to himself and to the world and elevated and improved socially, morally, intellectually, and physically. Gee, you have to wonder, did John Calhoun write that for him? Whenever one of these white supremacist scumbags claims that slavery did all these favors for black people and did them all that good, your first response should be, if slavery was so beneficial, why didn't white people make it exclusively for themselves? And just like Harvard and Yale, Vanderbilt also has a building named after those various slave owners and Confederate figures. But this is just one or two examples of who the United States educational system was founded by. The individuals who the most prestigious schools in the nation were started by and staffed by, and what ideas it is that they promote. This is why America's Ivy League universities are so eager to hire people like Amy Chua and to put them on every board and committee that the schools got. This is why the think tanks have such an easy time finding some Princeton or Columbia graduate who will manufacture their anti-black racist talking points. It's because anti-black racism is part of the Ivy League's DNA. They were built on slavery. The tens of billions that these institutions now own are the direct result of slavery in this country. Well, we're going to teach these Ivy League racists an economics lesson that Irving Fisher wouldn't have approved of. When you engage in anti-black racism, you will pay. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to recognize some of our contributors. Cloudwalker Z, Detroit Beauty Supply, Stephen Mugusa, Marzine, and Richard Brown. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.